Thank you all for coming. This is the book launch for a book by Professor Sumit Mandal over here, Becoming Arab, Creole Histories and Modern Identity in the Malay World. This event is organized by the Middle East Institute and the Asia Research Institute and the Al-Wahda Association, Arabic Association of Singapore. I'm happy to acknowledge Professor Jonathan Rigg, who is the director of the Asia Research Institute. Also, Mr. Alwi Aidid, who will show up, I think, soon from Al-Wahda Association. And of course, we here are in the Middle East Institute. This book, in a way, brings together our various institutes, these three institutes, because it is a book about Arabs. It is a book about Arabs in this region, in the Malay archipelago. In the Middle East Institute, we research the Middle East, but we also research the Middle East, or what we can call West Asia, in relation to the rest of Asia. So we would like the Middle East to look sometimes east rather than usually west. And so this is part of our mission to bring the Middle East or West Asia together with the rest of Asia. The Asia Research Institute, as you may know, sits in Singapore. And basically everything the Asia Research Institute does, to my mind, links various parts of Asia together. And in that sense, it's a very appropriate and central sort of institution for Singapore. Both institutes are interlinked in the sense that in the Asia Research Institute, we have an Inter-Asia cluster directed by Professor Rigg. And within this cluster, we have the Muhammad Al-Aghil Chair in Arabia-Asia Studies, which links Arabia and Asia. And in this institute, the Middle East Institute, we have a cluster called Arabia-Asia as well. And these two work closely together. This book itself is jointly published by the Muhammad Al-Aghil Chair at the Asia Research Institute and Cambridge University Press. So it comes out of this partnership, not to say that we wrote it, Sumit Mandal wrote it, but it's been part of this clusters of things which we are trying to build here in Singapore. So I'm very happy that Sumit's book is out and that we can host it here today, and thank you all for coming. Sumit Mandal is an associate professor in the School of Politics, History, and International Relations at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia campus. He got his PhD from Columbia University in New York and has had positions in the National University of Malaysia, in Germany, Humboldt University in Germany, and various other visiting positions. I'll open the floor up to the podium up to Sumit to tell us something about the book. And then we'll have some comments by Professor Nurfadzilah Yahaya of the History Department of NUS. And I'll say a few words and we'll open the floor up for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Engseng. Good evening to you all. I would like to thank the Middle East Institute of NUS and Al-Wahda Al-Arabiya bi Singapura, the Arab Association of Singapore, for organizing this event, for co-organizing this event. I'm also grateful to the Muhammad Al-Aghil Distinguished Professorship in Arabia-Asia Studies at RE, whose support enabled the publication of my book in softcover form. I thank Engseng Ho, Director of the Middle East Institute, and Muhammad Al-Aghil, Distinguished Professor in Arabia-Asia Studies, for inviting me, and Mr. Alwi Aidid of the Arab Association of Singapore for helping to make this event possible. Sharifa Huda Al-Junaid, Jamalia Jamil, Sharon Kwong, and Helen Lee put their best efforts into the organization of this event, and I'm very grateful for all the work they put in. I was happy to learn that Nurfadzilah Yahaya would be the discussant today, and thank her and Engseng Ho for the roles they'll play on the panel this evening. Thank you all for making the time to be here. When I set out to write this book, I planned to write about a modernist Islamic movement that was established by Hadrami Arabs in Batavia, Jakarta today, just over 100 years ago. I ended up instead becoming fascinated by the history of Hadramis in the region and began to explore that. I did not ignore the movement I set out to study, the Irshadis or reformists, but they appear in the final chapter and not as the focus of the book as a whole. My book became a study of the long history of interactions of Hadramis with the Malay world and asked the question, how did the establishment of the colonial state in the 19th century change things? It is in the 19th century that the Dutch and the British, these two colonial powers introduce fixities in a world in which people, borders, politics, and languages were fluid in nature. The colonial state put in place clear boundaries in many aspects of life. My book is concerned with the introduction of racial boundaries in particular. The nation states that emerged in the region in the middle of the 20th century were established without much questioning of the colonial fixities like race. The Arab or other citizens of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore have come to be understood in much the same categorical terms established by the colonial state. Through racialized lenses, Hadrami communities of the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-independence periods have been regarded as the same or largely the same. My book explores the history of Hadramis at a vital time of transition from the pre-colonial to the colonial era to learn what happens to them in the process. It asks if Hadramis become the monodimensional Arab figures envisioned by their colonial rulers. Let me say something about the findings of the book briefly. The first of three parts of my book is titled A Creole Malay World and offers a glimpse of the multifaceted character of Hadrami life in the coastal sultanates of the 17th and 18th centuries. In this period, Hadramis were diplomats, scholars, and advisors of the court, as well as traders and writers. They married into ruling families and produced communities of Creoles, or Peranakan in Malay, who constituted practices and worldviews that were both Hadrami and Malay. A manuscript by a man named Abdullah al-Misri, a writer and trader who plied the seas of the region in the early 1800s, reveals a hybrid Malay world in which people's categories or status were not unchangeable. For instance, he tells the story of a Creole Chinese figure and convert to Islam, Baba Midun, who won the hand of a Madurese princess. Baba Midun thus came to be regarded as part of the Madurese nobility. From that moment on, Chinese were held in greater esteem and, quote, the tailors, the alcohol distillers, the cobblers, and even the pork butchers were ennobled. It's a nice way in which throws off certainly our contemporary ideas about categorical notions of identity when Chinese pork butchers become ennobled by a Muslim ruler. Let me show you a number of images now. I'm going to be showing some images from the book. This adorns the cover of the book, and it's by a watercolor from the mid-19th century And it's simply the Arabia, the Arab. But he's going to figure a little bit more as I move along, because in this is not so much to represent this early period of hybridity, but a time when colonial rule is better established and you have middlemen traders, presumably like him, like this figure here, who plied the interior of Java. But this is one of the few images I have of women from the community, and it's a really nice indication of that type of hybridity I was talking about, though it's later, again, in the 19th century, but you have elements of all kinds in this sort of classic European studio setup of Malay, Arab, Peranakan, or Creole influences. I won't be describing the images in detail. I'm showing them as I move along and talk about the book. And I would like to have them there in case anyone's interested, or and if the panelists would like to refer to them. And the third image is a sketch which unfortunately is not particularly clear, but again, it has a Hadrami mosque in a place called Gresik near Surabaya, which has Javanese and Chinese elements in its architectural styles. Now, what happens to this world of multifaceted figures, people who were traders, diplomats, scholars, advisors to the court? What happens to this world as the bureaucratic apparatus of the colonial state becomes more and more established in the 19th century? The second part of my book is titled Colonial Transformation and describes in some detail the process of colonial racialization, focusing mostly on Java under Dutch rule. Now, this part of the book describes the making of racial categories and how they were enforced through a strategy of emplacement. Arabs, Chinese, and others were classified as foreign and forced to reside in quarters designated to them. Movement beyond these quarters was controlled by issuing travel passes. Communities of Creole Arabs were increasingly constrained, but importantly for us to keep in mind, they were not entirely transformed into the neat racial categories envisioned by the colonialists. Creole Arab leaders negotiated colonial repression in these forms in a number of ways. Let me show you a few more slides. This is the Arab quarter in Surabaya, just to get a sense. Again, unfortunately, the original black and whites are not particularly... It might help if we turn the... Yeah, unless you need the light on for some reason. Oh, I'm off. Yeah. Thank you. But it's just to give a sense of what would have been one of the places that Arabs would have been confined to. This is, the community leaders in Surabaya marking an important colonial event, and issues like this happen frequently, and so some of these people would have been in the colonial bureaucracy, appointed as captains or of their community, or in some other form involved in the administration of the community on behalf of the Dutch colonial government. Now, I think I have a few more slides. This set of pictures I like in particular because you can see how the same gentleman, he is the captain of a place called Tegal, fashioned himself, performed himself as someone in what might be identifiably Arab dress, and in the left side, and then on the right side you have him garbed in, I'd say, a local kind of Islamic dress, again with elements of different cultural influences. And this is a very famous illustration that accompanies a highly racialized description of Arabs as rapacious, sexually and economically, and it's been used a lot, this watercolor, and it accompanies a chapter of mine now in which I discuss the colonial apparatus of surveillance and the ways by which Arabs came to be racialized in particular forms, typically as Islamic troublemakers. That might be the last one. No, this is the final one. This is, of course, again, someone would be recognized by many of you, a man called Said Usman, who's seen to have been very much a pro-Dutch figure who fashioned himself as the Mufti of Batavia, the head Islamic figure of Batavia, though he was not formally appointed as such. But again, part of what I've tried to do, which is not easily suggested through these images alone, as evocative as they might be, is to, through the book, provide much more complex biographies of these figures. And that, too much of these histories have been about casting people as being pro-colonial or pro-nationalist. This gentleman obviously courted controversy, especially in the early period of the rise of early forms of nationalism, when he got he was awarded a Medal of Honor, from the Dutch crown, and which he's wearing, as you can see before you. So that didn't go too well with many Arabs who were critical of the Dutch. But once again, a complex figure who's multilingual, whose ability, in particular, not just in Arabic, but in local languages, allowed him to translate and influence a lot of Islamic thinking in what is today Indonesia in the early 20th century. But following from these images are connected to the part that looks at the colonial transformations, the creation of a bureaucracy, and it's the second part of the book. Now, the third part of my book is titled Modern Identity, and this part focuses on how Creole Arabs looked west to the Ottoman Empire to seek an Islamic modernity and establish organizations, schools, and newspapers in Java to realize their worldview. A small circle of wealthy landowners in Batavia sent their children to study in elite Ottoman schools in Istanbul and elsewhere. Many Arabs in the region subscribed to periodicals emanating from Istanbul, Cairo, and Beirut, carrying modernist Islamic ideas. Some actively corresponded with at least one major periodical, Al-Manar, which published the exchange of opinions from correspondents from this region and learned scholars who established this newspaper, this journal. There was a lively organizational and intellectual life in Batavia, Surabaya, Singapore, and Penang. The early strivings for modernity were led largely by Sayyids, people of prophetic descent. Nearly all the children who were sent to the Ottoman Empire to study, for instance, were from Sayyid families. Just over 100 years ago, in 1915, an organization emerged to counter Sayyid authority. And this was established by the Irshadis, or reformists, I had set out to study initially, and I mentioned at the outset. A modern Arab identity constituted by Sayyid elites came to be contested by competing notions of modernity that rested on more egalitarian principles. Now, I end my book with this moment of contestation over Arab identities. And by doing so, I propose that the question of ethnicity, race, and identity is dynamic rather than static. Let me show you a few more slides connected to the third part. This was just one of numerous images one could find to suggest the kind of dynamism. This is one of the first the publications in Java of and the region by people connected to Arab communities, by men from Palembang who moves to Java, moves to Batavia, and it's published in Arabic and Malay. It contains ads from Chinese traders, Javanese traders. It's just a colorful, lively, printed space, much like many other kinds of publications of its time. This is an image of the Galatasaray Lycée in Istanbul, to which a few of these young Arab children were sent in the late 19th century, an elite Ottoman school, just to get a sense of the and you know, their appreciation, their experience of a kind of modernity emerging in Istanbul at that time. And these are figures, a studio portrait in early 20th century. And you see the figure on the left influenced by a kind of Ottoman modernism, wearing a fez, which at that moment contravene Dutch sumptuary laws, colonial sumptuary laws. So in one case, a young man was arrested for wearing this, and then it led to a bit of a controversy. But these were important statements, albeit by a small group of people, but which were important because they resonated more widely. Let me make some concluding remarks, because I look forward to hearing from my colleagues on the panel and from you. And I think I shall leave you with what I think are some of the broader ramifications of my book. My book is a departure from the scholarship on ethnicity and race, because typically the story of Arabs, or indeed Chinese, Indian, or other categories regarded as foreign to the region, are written from the point of view of the independent nation states that emerged in the 20th century. The categories produced under colonialism of indigenous and foreigner are taken for granted rather than interrogated. Ethnic or racial groups are seen as neat blocks that have existed unchanged for hundreds of years. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, the independent nation states that constitute the Malay world in the book, perpetuate racialized categories, then view the negotiations, solidarities, and tensions in the rise of modern identities. By focusing on Creole Hadramis, my book calls attention to Creole histories as a way of appreciating the complex relationships that have existed historically between outsiders and insiders. The purpose is not to celebrate Creolity, but to consider the past through its lens. From this point of view, what unfolds are connections rather than disjunctures across racial, ethnic, and national boundaries and spaces, interrelationships rather than discrete entities existing side by side to each other. With the book, my purpose is not to portray a utopian vision of a trans-ethnic or hybrid social order, but to cast a measure of doubt on the racialized perspectives prevalent in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore by substantiating these countries' Creole histories. I have a few more images to show you and thereby conclude my my short talk. This is a silsila, a genealogy of the Sultanate, the kingdom rather, the Raja of Perlis, the kingdom of Perlis. And it's a document that if you've had, many of you here would have read The Graves of Tarim by Engseng Ho, and you would understand from it the significance of genealogies. And I wanted to show this genealogy. It appears in the epilogue of my book, which tries to think about the story of the book after 1915 or so, when I ended. What are its ramifications? What are the kinds of questions around Arabness that we can think about until the present time? And this is a genealogy that appeared in the early 2000s when the Raja of Perlis, the King of Perlis, became the supreme ruler of Malaysia, which many of you will know has a rotating kingship shared among 9 states. And it's interesting that at this moment in time, one could look at a connection not only to the Prophet Muhammad, but a connection to the Prophet Muhammad through Yemen, through Hadrami histories. And the epilogue takes the view that there is the kinds of histories that I've discussed in the book come to be suppressed during the period of the emerging nation states. In Malaysia, for instance, many people of Arab descent would have typically not publicly identified themselves as Arab. They would have publicly identified themselves as ethnic Malay, given the kinds of racialized politics that existed there. But in the early 2000s, we saw a change in the public circumstances and politics and various things that happened, including the rise of a king of Hadrami descent to the rotating kingship of the Federation of Malaysia. So what's very interesting about this genealogy is how it represents other sorts of things that are then recalled or returned to public debate in Malaysia around questions of identity. And I'm curious how Creole histories or the long-standing interactions between Hadramis in the Malay world come to be interpreted and understood in racialized environments like Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, because they don't fit easily into neat blocks. Of course, many of you would have also seen in the region its great uses to marketing food, because you now have Hadrami restaurants or Yemeni restaurants, typically Hadrami restaurants with names that come from the Hadramaut, something that even 10 years ago would have been relatively unknown, and few people would have even recognized the term Hadramaut. But nowadays, it also has some market value. This is an image of interest because you have one-time Malaysian Minister of Defense with a very well-known Sayyid from the Hadramaut, a man called Sayyid Al-Jufri. They each are performing their roles in a particularly powerful way, in the ways they are robed. Sayyid Al-Bar, Hamid Al-Bar on the right, in 2005 opened the first regional conference on the Hadrami Yemeni diaspora at the Islamic University in Kuala Lumpur. And what's interesting about it is he comes to it and acknowledges his Arab descent, so acknowledges Arab histories, but he certainly does make sure to represent himself in the requisite formal uniform of his ethnic political party. But he does something quite remarkable, because he talks about how one can integrate this long history with being a citizen of this nation state, which, for my purposes, even if it complicates thinking and inspires more research, more thinking, more informed ideas about society, I'm quite happy to live with. The other important point to raise with this gentleman is his father represented a particularly, and I use the words of other scholars, nasty form of chauvinist politics, racialized politics. So he was seen as the counterpart of Lee Kuan Yew. If one were to suggest that Lee Kuan Yew stood for a vile Chinese-centered politics, well, his father would have stood at the time for a vile Malay-centered politics. So they were both seen as ultras in the language of the late 60s, early 70s. But here we go, the son emerges in 2005 to represent a different kind of understanding of the past. So that's why he's there, and I believe with that image I end my talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sumit, for giving us a good conspectus of your book. We realize that many people in the audience would not have read the book yet, so I think this has been very helpful. We have Nurfadzilah giving us a response.
Thank you, Engseng, for inviting me to be on this book panel. The book, Becoming Arab, Creole Histories and Modern Identity in the Malay World, was based on Sumit Mandal's doctoral dissertation in 1994 at Columbia, which was already a pioneering work in the field 24 years ago. The thesis was referred to by various scholars that came after, including myself. I certainly used it as a guide when I did archival research as a PhD student at Princeton in the colonial archives of KIT-LV in Leiden and The Hague. In the thesis, Sumit explored the concept of creolization as applied to a community previously not considered Creole in the traditional sense. That is the Arab diaspora in Southeast Asia. Since then, the term has been picked up by other scholars such as Engseng Ho. The framework of creolization, or its close cousins, peranakaness, and cultural hybridity have undergirded studies of Muslim cosmopolitanism in the Indian Ocean especially for the past 2 decades, and it forms the core of this book. The book is immensely detailed and encyclopedic in scope, being a transnational work focused on Netherlands Indies primarily, and Hadramaut, and also Malaysia, which was not really featured in the thesis, in the PhD dissertation. It is organized, as Sumit said, chronologically in 3 parts: Creole, Malay World, Colonial Transformation, and Modern Identity. It is more than a who's who of renowned Arabs in the Netherlands, Indies, and Malaya, since it looks at the entire Arab community as a whole. The periodic frameworks do inform one another, however. For example, the prominence of the Saids were propped up by the British in the Straits settlements, especially Singapore. And in oppressing Said dominance in a way, the Dutch also highlighted their prominence and constantly overestimated their importance in local societies in the Netherlands Indies. So I wonder whether these categories that we see in the archives are because of colonial categories, or the way they overread into something and so on and so forth, which might not accurately reflect what's on the ground. The book extends the time frame of the dissertation right up till today, and also includes the history of Arabs in Malaysia as well, to a certain degree, which was not in the dissertation, as I said before. We see the change over time and trace what mattered in terms of colonial legacies and what do not carry over to the post-colonial period in both countries. As Sumit says in his epilogue on page 210, placing these groups in long-term perspective, as we have done in this book, will reveal more complex interactions than does the racialized foreigner-indigenous dichotomy. We are able to see in the book what was confined to the logic of the colonial in both Malaya and Indonesia, and what was discarded during and after the colonial period by Malaysians and Indonesians themselves. The problem with the Arabs from the Dutch colonial perspective is that they never figured out the exact clout of the Arabs or the scope of the influence of the Arabs in the Netherlands Indies. By default, in most regions of Java, they were the heads of other non-Chinese and non-Japanese foreign Orientals, people classified as Klinga-Lezen, South Indians, and Benga-Lezen, North Indians, Moran, which refers to an undefined group of Muslims, Malays, Makassaris, and Bugis, all of whom were classified as foreign Orientals in Java. And of course, the Arabs' religious faith and mixed identities meant that they were also close to the majority of the native population. The only people that were constantly classified as native were the Javanese throughout the Netherlands Indies, especially in the cities, mainly through intermarriage. While the influence and authority of Chinese foreign Orientals were assumed to be circumscribed either by the Chinese themselves or through Dutch restrictive policies, Arab authority made Dutch colonial authorities anxious because it was uncertain and often assumed to be larger than it actually was. The history of ethnic identity is hardly about ethnicity or race per se. This is now an assumption that goes without saying. Historically, across the world, race or ethnicity is a factor that is often invoked to justify or rationalize existing policies that were already aimed to discriminate at the first instance. I'll be interested to know about the role of Arabs themselves in Malaya, and I'm going to devote the rest of my comments to Malaysia because it wasn't featured in the dissertation, but it is in the book, so I find it even more intriguing. I'll be interested to know about the role of Arabs themselves in perpetuating Malay superiority in Malaysia. Sumit offers us a comprehensive view of institutional changes that enable this equation of non-Malay Muslims with Malays to occur over time, and Iza Hussein's book provides a very good analysis, almost a blow-by-blow account of constitutional changes over the past few decades since independence. It remains remarkable that even after the course of the 19th century, when racial categories hardened in colonial Southeast Asia, in both Malaya and Indonesia, in the Netherlands Indies, that this equation could happen. While the book offers us detailed account of Arabs under Dutch colonial rule, we don't really see how Arabs were treated and perceived on the Malay Peninsula, which was subjected to different degrees of colonization with the Federated Malay States, Unfederated Malay States, and of course the Strait Settlements. There's no reason why Malayans would continue adopting this or that British colonial legacy, such as political or legal system and system of racial classification, as well as definitions of indigeneity. The deliberate choices they made have to be explained by scholars. What was the role of Arabs themselves in accentuating their Malayness, not necessarily at the expense of their Arabness, as far as I can see in Malaysia? As a group, Arabs seem to be more successful in being Malays, more than Indian Muslims, whether they were mixed or not. I mean, the Indians, whether they were mixed or not. Ironically, the term peranakan, or Jawi peranakan, has been more commonly claimed by Indian Muslims, more so than Arabs in general. It's almost like they downplayed their Creoleness in this way, and yet are able to make this leap. Therefore, an interesting question that we could ask is whether Arabs actually give up anything in being classified as Malay in Malaysia today. What exactly did they sacrifice, if anything at all? They are fewer in number than the latter, of course, than the Indian Muslims, and perhaps were seen as less of a threat by Malays, and not to mention their sanctity associated with Arabia or even descent from the Prophet. Undoubtedly, in Malaysia, Arabs, or rather those of Arab descent, along with Muslims of Indian descent, benefit from being closely associated with the Malays and attained the much coveted racial classification as such. And with that came the associated privileges of those regarded as indigenous, that is Bumiputra. How did their political strategies take shape post-1957? Other questions linger. Was there a concerted effort with other non-Malay Muslims? Arab cultural closeness with Arabia is not sufficient to explain this in decades following independence. At the same time, Arabness is more pronounced, especially in terms of names. It's more obvious, especially if there's Said. In that, I could also draw a comparison with Singapore, where clan names are often officially preserved. In Malaysia, it doesn't seem to be the case. For example, Syed Saddiq is just Syed Saddiq, the MP in Muar. He doesn't have his clan name, like Asagaf or something like that, at the end of his official name. Whereas in Singapore, most Arabs would preserve their clan names as part of their official names. So how do we draw a line from the discrimination that these Arabs faced in the 1920s and 1930s in Malaya and Singapore to post-1957 Malaya right up to today? Here we can further extend the question that Sumit asked on page 231. To what extent can we credit the absence of ethnicization to the long-standing fluidity and inclusive character of cultural identity in the Malay world that excludes other ethnic groups, such as the Chinese, but not the Arabs? Sumit's book is exhaustive, clearly written, and undoubtedly a welcome contribution to several different fields, namely history of the Indian Ocean, diaspora studies, history of migration, and of course, history of Southeast Asia. I congratulate him on a fine publication that has proven to be useful for scholars in all these fields. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fadila, for giving us a view of the book from the point of view of someone who works in this field. I thought I would say a few words also, since Sumit and I have been working in this field for some time. We first met, I think, around the early 90s. Actually, he says we bumped into each other on the street in New York. I don't quite remember, but somehow we have known each other since the early 90s. Just to give you a little biographical sense of why we do this, perhaps, or what it means to us. I'm Malaysian, Sumit is Malaysian. We are both non-Muslims, we are not Malays, and we work on Arabs. You have an Indian kid and a Chinese kid working on Arabs. In Malaysia, in the Malaysian context, it is weird. And I think in the Singapore context also it is weird. People think somehow maybe he has a Malay girlfriend or something. I don't know. I don't know about that. I don't know about Sumit, but I won't say for myself. But I think it is not so weird if you think of where we come from, not in a racial sense, but in terms of place. I'm from Penang, a place which is quite similar to Singapore. Sumit is from Klang. These are both very mixed places. Sumit speaks Hokkien very well, in fact. In some ways, perhaps instinctively, the holy trinity of Malaysia and Singapore also, which we grew up with, that is to say, the three great races, the Indians, the Chinese, the Malays, that leaves too much out of what we knew growing up in these very mixed places. There were huge gaps between the national understanding of racial politics and what we knew growing up in such places. So I think studying Arabs, especially in this region, I suppose, is a way of fishing around in those very large gaps. As Fazila has said, and Sumit also, in this region, Arabs are often thought of as Malays, sometimes as Javanese, sometimes as Buginese, depending on where and when. Sometimes Indian, when they admit to a grandfather coming from a place like Surat or Malabar. And in Hadramaut, if you go to Hadramaut in South Yemen, where many of the Arabs from this region go to when they are naughty kids, when they are sent home, when they go to Arabia, they are teased by the term Sini, which is Chinese, because of their fair complexion, slit eyes, and they are called Sangket, which is actually a Hokkien word for a new arrival, a new guest. So there's a sense of someone coming to the country, an Arab from Singapore going to Hadramaut, a little awkward, making mistakes in grammar, an object of ridicule, but also someone one could feel sorry for, someone a little bit awkward, harmless, and someone who could even be an object of affection. So the term Singket over there has all these associations. And many of these Arab Singkets, in fact, were sent to Hadramaut, to the father or grandfather's homeland with their Chinese mothers. Often they had Chinese mothers, and the mothers would go back with them. These Chinese women were or had been adopted by Arab families when they were young, because Chinese families did not like girls, so they sold them off or gave them away. Adopted by Arab and Malay families, and then married into these Malay-Arab communities. And so in the case of the Arabs, they then give birth to Arab sons and daughters who are sent back to Hadramaut. So in fact, these Arabs are also Chinese. So when you find out about these things, it becomes less weird for a good Chinese boy from Penang or a good Indian boy from Klang to study the Arabs in the Malaysian context. When you think of Arabs in this sense, then Sumit's book, the title of the book starts to make sense. If a kid, let's say, from an Arab father from Pontianak and a Chinese mother from Pontianak, finds himself or herself in Hadramaut, he or she has to learn to become Arab. Moving from Pontianak to Tarim in Hadramaut, you find that you do not live up to expectations of what an Arab is or should behave. You come as some kind of weird mixture, and you learn to conform to become Arab. Sumit's book, Becoming Arab, Creole Histories and Modern Identity in the Malay World, is all about people who were born into mixed families, spoke, read, and wrote multiple languages, ate all kinds of rojak, responded to changing expectations in a variety of places and times. This is a book which takes a wide-angle lens to our region of Southeast Asia, the Malay world or archipelago, and opens up views and vistas in a world which has become very tight and crowded today. I will simply say that it became tight and crowded beginning in the colonial period, as Sumit shows, and became even more so in the new nations after independence. Whether it is Indians and Chinese coming as pendatangs or latecomers, or foreign talent and PRC Chinese coming to Singapore, crowding the subways, that tightness or sense of tightness seems to me much higher than in the colonial period. From that point of view, reading Becoming Arab feels quite therapeutic to me. Why therapeutic? Because the book opens up with a view to the sea. There is the Indian Ocean, there is wind, there is water. Arabs come from, in Malay, what they call atas angin to bawah angin, that is to say from above the wind to below the wind with the monsoon winds. They come not only in one direction, but they blow around the whole archipelago. The book opens with the patron saint of Batavia, the keramat of Syed Hussein Al-Aidarus in Luar Batang, at the end of the 18th century. And then it takes us on to places like Palembang, Riau, Pontianak, this whole maritime world. Now, across this maritime world, there's a category of persons known as Tuan Syed or Lord Syed in English. I'll just read you a short quote from Sumit's book, and he has a quotation from this person, Al-Misri, who describes some of these Arabs in Pontianak. Al-Misri says, "Know all of you, my kin, that I have drunk the water of the Pontianak River, and have thus been filled with a deep yearning and abundant love and passion and longing for the people who are in Pontianak. Firstly, Sri Paduka Maulana Sultan Sharif Qasim and Sri Paduka Pangeran Ratu Sharif Uthman Ibn Al-Marhum Sultan Sharif Abdurrahman and Paduka Pangeran Sharif Omar bin Muhammad and Sharif Sheikh bin Hamid Ba Abud," and so on and so forth. These are including Sharif Hassan bin Omar Al-Marhum Al-Habshi Ba Alwi, the most dignified, as a result of the great yearning for them, all of them of noble descent, who am lowly, write on this paper. We see from this quote multiple identities being put together. Person is Sultan, person is Sharif, descendant of the Prophet, of noble descent. The person is also endowed with names from multiple languages, from Arabic, from Sanskrit, Paduka, from Javanese, Pangeran, and so on. So we have an agglomeration of dimensions or identities vested in single individuals. In other words, these individuals are Creoles, they're intermixed, but they are also locals and at home. Their fathers and grandfathers may be Arabs, but their mothers are Malay, Buginese, Javanese, Chinese, Dutch, and so on. So what we have here is a maritime world, a crossroads of world trade, where the monsoons meet, where ships come from China, Arabia, Sulawesi, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, and so on. And where the ships come to land, the port cities, is where these whole societies develop. These ships, these trading lines, are the living blood streams which shape and nourish the leading port cities of each age: Malacca, Aceh, Johor Riau, and today I would say Singapore. This is the Malay world as depicted in Sumit's book, where mixed people form at the intersections of these streams, and these mixed peoples are actually, I think Sumit asserts, natives to these port cities. And so this is a key innovation of this book, that it makes this the starting point of how we should understand Arabs in this region. The key point is that it sits in this intersection of world streams, and that the persons who are native to these intersections are by necessity mixed. So the mixedness is the starting point. Now this is interesting because in this region you have an idea that there is a native form of sovereignty in what is called the Malay world, beginning with a place called Malacca, where a sultanate was formed, and this Malay sultanate formed in Malacca then gave its form and its sovereign legitimacy to subsequent polities such as Siak, Pontianak, Palembang, and so on, all the way to eastern Indonesia. So that is one view of Malacca, this ethnic dimension and an ethnicized form of polity. But there is also a different Malacca, a Malacca in which the officers of state come from and represent different parts of the region, such as coming from India, coming from eastern Indonesia, coming even from the Ryukyu Islands, which is today in Japan. So these are two different views or understandings of Malacca, and these two different views are actually enshrined in the Malaysian educational curriculum through two books, two native texts. One is the Sejarah Melayu, and the other is the Tufat an-Nafis. Now, growing up in Malaysia, these are the two books we study, or shortened versions. Now, the Tufat was never properly understood. The Sejarah Melayu is the history of this Malay peninsula, and that is understood as the Tanah Melayu, the original land of the Malays. The Tufat Nafis has quite a different geography. It was written in Riau, just south of Singapore, in Pulau Penyengat, which is actually where Stamford Raffles went to negotiate Singapore. In the Tufat and Nafis, you find Arabs, Buginese, Chinese, all kinds of people of this archipelago interacting, trading, doing politics, and so on. This book was written at a point when the Dutch had just beaten this Arab Bugis conglomerate, taken over Malacca, and was on the cusp of ruling what is now Malaya, what is now Indonesia. So this book was written at the point of, let's say, the formation of Singapore, the division of Indonesia and Malaysia across down the Straits of Malacca and across between what is now Singapore and Riau. So this book is quite a key text in the formation of modern Malaysia and Singapore, written just after the defeat to the Dutch. And it is a book which is read but not understood by Malaysian school children because of this broad transnational geography. Now, this brings me to the key point of the first part of Sumit's book, which is that it is normal for peoples to be living, working, reproducing in places far beyond their notional homelands or origins. In Pontianak, you have Arabs, Malays, Bugis, sometimes all within one person of the Sultan. In a different language, Sumit's book asserts that diasporas are normal. This is not the usual view we have of diasporas as exceptional. This is a view which comes out of the modern Jewish model of the Galut, diaspora as exile. This has been the dominant understanding of diasporas. Sumit's book asserts that diasporas are normal. So this is a very different starting point. Not only are they normal, they are also Creole. So you don't start with purity, you start with mixedness, and this is the starting point, the baseline of his book, as Fazila correctly notes. And there is no better place to see this notion of diaspora as normal, Creole as baseline, than the Malay world, because the Malay world is a world in which Creoles are native. Creoles are native to such a world. Now, having set out this baseline, the book then asks, the book asks a question, how did these mixed peoples, Creoles, become Arabs? Now, if we take the lesson from this book, we can stretch our minds further to say, how do Creole Indians, Creole Chinese become Indians, become Chinese, become pure Europeans? In a word, how do Peranakans become Toto? This is where the second part of the book moves into. Under Dutch rule, Sumit shows in the second part of this book how Creoles become Arabs. This is the whole middle part of the book. It has to do with control of populations, a pass and quarter system, essentially the imposition of a European notion of race equals language, equals culture, equals nation, equals religion. And the book shows how the Arabs evolve into this sort of European mold. I must admit, it's not my favorite part of the book, because it makes me feel a bit claustrophobic. But it is what happens in this period. Essentially, the wide maritime world, which the first part of the book opened with, becomes compressed and constrained when things move onto land. But the interesting thing is, this is not simply a colonial story, because there are other things going on with the Arabs, natives, others playing a big role. Arab trade, which had been dominant up to about the 1870s, about half to three-quarters of all ships in the region were owned by these Arab Creoles. There was a huge alliance between an Arab family and a Bugis family, which linked the major shippers going from Jeddah to this region and the major shippers going from this region to eastern Indonesia, who were Buginese. There was a marriage between these Arab and Bugis families, and you can see the descendants buried in what is called the Hajjah Fatima Mosque on Beach Street in Singapore. So at that time, you had this major shipping alliance. What happens is, with the arrival of steamships, with European domination, Arab capital moves to land. When Arab capital moves to land, then you start to see competition between Creole Arabs, Creole Chinese in real estate, in Batik, in Crete, and so on. And through this process, then you have a strange process of interaction, looking more and more like each other. One side starts a school, the other side starts a similar school. One side starts newspapers, the other start newspapers. Arabs start to compete with Chinese. Creole Arabs start to create associations like the Syarikat Dagang Islam, where they associate with Javanese. And so you have the beginning of a racialized politics taking place across Java. So there is this quite interesting story of how this sort of thing develops, not simply out of European impetus, but as the political economy unfolds from a maritime world to a territorial world. I will just say that this second part of the world creates or models this tightening of the world, this creation of racial categories out of a mixed Creole fluid world, this tightening. The third part of the book changes tack to show us openings again, as Sumit has mentioned. Arabs start to go to Turkey for education. You have newspapers, which are both religious and commercial. You have them helping Turkey with the Red Crescent and so on. So the third part of the book takes us in another direction to one in which the world opens up again. Now, I will just end by saying that these movements of the book, the opening, the closing, the opening up again, I think bear for us great lessons for today, because since 9/11, as we all know, Arabs have gotten a bad name, bad press. We have Rizik Shihab of FBI in Indonesia and so on. We have various Arabs being fingered as Arabs, as terrorists and so on. What Sumit's book teaches us is not to fall into yet another trap, another form of compression, by showing us through historical work, through empirical work, and through characterizing the phases of openings, closings, and openings again. The book teaches us not to read things in only one dimension, but in the multiple dimensions. And really, one can see these multiple dimensions only if one has a full stretch of history to not be locked into one period. Thank you.